Hello, friends, neighbors, co-defendants. Good to see you. I'm Tad. I will be here for about an hour. I'm going to do some reading. Before I do reading, I am going to count very slowly from 1 to a million, just to fill space. No, I'm not going to do that. No, I am going to say hello. I am not going to apologize for my office at this point because everybody knows it's the way it is. And we did a huge amount of cleaning upstairs today, which will eventually lead to me being able to clean down here. And then we won't have quite such a ghastly background. If I were a better online person, an online person with pride and self-respect, I would have long ago gone to some kind of a artificial background, little wallpaper, maybe lovely Hawaiian ocean or Sierra Mountains waterfalls or something like that looked like I cared about myself and my approach to life. But I figure I'm giving you guys the unvarnished truth here, and the unvarnished truth is I'm living in an office that looks like this. Actually, you guys can't see the worst of it. There are worse parts than what you're looking at. But anyway, enough about the office. Who cares? Other than that, same stuff I reported last night. Basically, all but finished with Ordinary Farm 3. Looking forward to getting into the next book, although I've still got stuff to do on both Navigator's Children and Ordinary Farm. And let me think, what else? Yeah. Going to Germany at the end of this month into early June, or into the first 2 weeks of June. I know this is tends to be more American listeners on this one, so I won't go into too many details. Although I always enjoy going to Germany, and that will be nice. And this time Deb gets to go with me, which will be nice too. And we will have a good time. Upstairs, my family is having a home-cooked meal that they cooked for themselves, but I said I can't eat until after I finish reading. Because if I eat a big, lovely meal like that, all the blood in my system is going to rush to my stomach. My head will just slowly collapse like at a party when somebody hits a ping pong ball off the table and somebody accidentally steps on it. That's what I'll look like if I eat too much, because the blood will all rush to my stomach. Anyway, but I'm very aware of it because they made a very nice pasta that I can smell from here. And it smells lovely. What else? So we won't be hearing the dog barking to announce the arrival of pizza tonight. One of the little perks of listening to my Sunday evening readings that you will not get to participate in, and I apologize. Okay, anything else that I really need to mention? Nah, just having another week of work and making sense of life, or trying to, and just stuff. Not a whole lot to say. Which is not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. Usually when I have things to say, it's because I'm grumpy or tired or disheartened or whatever, or just want to complain, which is a very human thing to want to do. But at the moment, I don't really have any complaints, and rather than manufacture some, I will leave it at that. So let me see who's showed up and said hello, if anyone, at this point. And what do we got? We've got Pierre Danger Fuqua. And I still don't know, Pierre, if that's danger, if we're going straight French. I know Fuqua is actually quite often it is Acadien. I know that Fuqua is a common Acadien name from Louisiana in the South. And Acadien, for those of you who don't know, most of you probably already know this, but Acadien is what the word Cajun comes from. Acadien, Cajun. Ivan the Batnik Master. Good to see you, buddy. Jeremy, you too. Good to see you. Claudia, James, Tracy. Hello, all of you. Isaac, Barb, Ann, Emily, Angie, Medardo, Ray Weatherford, Michael. Hello, Michael. I haven't seen you as much, but good to see you. Christy and Susan. And yes, that's a possibility, Ivan. It's definitely a possibility. We will be in touch about that. And let me think. Is there anything else? Am I going to spend most of the entire hour reading this time? That would be a weird and unusual thing. Was there anything else I wanted to tell anybody about? Because I will regret it later if I don't think of it now. Anyway, not to worry, not to worry. So, where were we in the reading? I'm stalling just a little bit because I know some people tune in slightly, a few minutes after the beginning. Not that I blame them, because the more you tune in late, the less you have to listen to me blather and bloviate, pontificate, and generally just run my mouth. It is what I do. I did radio for years, so I can do this all day. I won't, I promise, honest to goodness. I promise I won't do it, but I could. That is one of the horrifying things that I discovered when I was in the radio biz and in the early days when I was DJing before I started doing talk shows. I would, occasionally you would have something go wrong. Either one of the pot switches was broken on the control board, or you snapped a belt on the turntable and somebody was trying to fix it in the background, and you just had to keep from just doing dead air. And you could only run so many public service announcements back to back before people start to just go switch off. So, yeah, I've done this kind of thing before. I'm not proud of it. I don't think it's really necessarily anything to brag about. Oh yeah, I can talk about absolutely nothing for half an hour at a stretch if necessary. But it also probably describes most of my ordinary conversation as well. So, it's not like I haven't been able to put it to use in the real world. I have. So, anything else that I wanted to... No, I'm just stalling here. What I should do is just go ahead and read. Because, it's on, I almost never start reading before like 7:15 or like 15 minutes into the reading. So I might as well start early tonight. Let me just double check in case anybody had a question or anything they wanted to ask. No, everybody's just saying hello, which is lovely, that's really good enough. So yeah, I said hello to everybody here. Anybody else showed up? Susan, I don't know if I said hello to Susan, but I'm saying it now. Hello, Susan Chamblin. Good to see you. All right, so I will return to the reading, and we will have a good chunk of reading. So anyway, Simon and Miriamel are having a meeting with the lector's envoy. The lector, of course, is the highest official of the Adonite Church. The escritors are the next level down from the lector himself. And himself is the useful pronoun here because, as in the medieval world, they probably didn't ever have a female pontiff, because that's just the way those churchmen of semi-medieval, civilizations rolled. There is, of course, famous, probably apocryphal stories about Pope Joan, but that's another story for another day, and it's not anything I'm going to go whipping off on as a tangent. So anyway, in the book itself, in the Witchwood Crown, Miriamel and Simon are having an official royal hearing of the lector's envoy, Escritor Auxis, Auxis, in case you're curious how that was spelled. And so the whole procession has just come up from the cathedral, and they've just arrived. And Miriamel is the first to speak. So we're going to just go ahead and start with the book. When Auxis had been seated and the rest of the preliminaries finished, she, Miriamel, squeezed Simon's hand to let him know she was going to speak. "We know why you are here, Your Eminence," she said, "and we hope we will be able to find a way to help our beloved sacred father, the lector. And his sacredness is grateful to you for making time for his humble servant and messenger." Miriamel almost looked around in comic confusion because nobody would ever mistake Escritor Auxis for a servant, especially not the humble sort. But she restrained herself. It was just the sort of thing she had scolded Simon for in the past. Well, what was it about Auxis that brought out these childish resentments in her? "We all have the same interests, Your Eminence," she said. "You, his sacredness, my husband, myself. We all want peace for our people." After that conventional opening, Oxus clearly felt he had a grip on the situation again. He nodded and began a disquisition on the current state of affairs in Naban, one that, although it stuck more or less to the truth, played down the sins of House Ingadorus and played up the efforts of the Sancellan Adenitis to find a solution. The fact that his sacredness owed his position largely to his connection with Count Dallo, one of the main authors of the problems, was not a part of the Escritor's summation. Not that Miriamel had expected it would be. Descriptions and counter-descriptions of the exact problems went on for the best part of an hour, couched in courteous language, as befitted a meeting between Mother Church and the High Throne. But Miriamel could see that Escritor Oxus was already frustrated. He had expected an agreement to the lector's request for the king and queen to attend the wedding of Drusus and Turia Ingadorus as a matter of form only, and was dismayed by the idea that he might actually have to bargain for it. I beg both your majesties' pardon, he said at last, but we have talked half the day, and I fear I do not understand whether or not you will answer his sacredness regarding the counsel he has given you. If by counsel you mean the Sacred Father's request that the High Throne give its blessing by attending the wedding, the answer is yes. She smiled. The Escritor, relieved, smiled back. He was indeed a fine-looking man when he was in a good mood, Miriamel noted. She wondered if that would still be true when his mood changed. It is most likely that the High Throne will be present at the wedding and will work with the feuding parties in Naban to make peace. I am very pleased to hear that, majesties, Oxus said, spreading his arms as if in benediction. And I can assure you that our sacred father, Lector Vidian, will be pleased too. Excellent. Miriamel squeezed Simon's hand beneath the table to let him know the time had come. He made a little snorting noise. You always think I'll say something to spoil things, he whispered. Shush, husband, she said. The fish is almost in the net. She raised her voice. And the High Throne will formally agree to the invitation as soon as his sacredness grants us a few small kindnesses in turn that would please us very greatly. The ordinary background of murmured asides and the scratch of pens on parchment suddenly ceased. Are you proposing that his sacredness should strike a deal? Said Oxus, making it sound like the sort of thing usually done in dark alleyways. All eyes now went from his pale, strained features to the queen. Surely not, Miriamel said. The blessed patriarch has kindly offered us his advice, his counsel, as you so neatly put it, to which we are giving very careful thought. And since we have this splendid opportunity, due to his so generously sending a high official of the church, like yourself, we have some counsel we would like to tender in turn. Beside her, Simon did his best to stifle a laugh, but was not entirely successful. She squeezed his hand again, slightly harder this time. I know, he said, so that only she could hear. It was all Oxus could do not to glare. He leaned and whispered something to his clerks, and when he turned back to the table, his expression had been wiped clean of all emotions except patient interest. I would be very happy to hear what counsel the High King and Queen would offer to his sacredness. Miriamel's smile was a little tighter this time. Very well. The High Queen and the High King suggest that we are overdue another escritor from the north. The last three have been from Naban or Perdruin or the islands. Surely his sacredness would not wish his northern flock to think we are forgotten by the Sancellan Adenitis. Ah, said Oxus, I see. And would you have a suggestion for the Blessed Father? How about Archbishop Jervis? Proposed Simon, a little too abruptly for Miriam's taste. She closed her eyes and said a little prayer, then put on a pacific smile. Yes, how about Jervis? The lector could raise no one to the synod we favor more. He is a man of high learning and high ideals. Archbishop Jervis, caught by surprise, stared open-mouthed from his seat, as at a holy miracle. Oxus lifted an eyebrow in a finely calibrated gesture of bemusement. Well, of course the Archbishop is held in great esteem by his sacredness. Good, said Simon. That's settled then. Securing an escritor's golden robe for Jervis had been the part that her loyal husband had most favored. Oxus was clearly realizing that if his master only had to raise one northern archbishop to the escritorial synod, it was not much to give up. Some of the tension went out of his posture, and he even smiled and nodded at Jervis, who still looked flustered. But all this means, Miriam thought, is that things must be worse in Naman than we realized. Vidian would never let anyone dictate to him, not even us, if he did not need our help badly. That gave her a bit of a chill, but she had set her course and could not slacken now. So, said Oxus in the tone of someone about to make a summary speech, if we have heard and satisfied the desires of our revered high monarchs, there is yet a bit more counsel from us, your eminence. The escritor turned to her, and this time his eyes were wary. Of course, Majesty. Forgive me for anticipating. As far as the visit itself, she said, if a peace between two antagonistic parties is to be brokered, the lector himself must be part of the process. And that means he must show his support by a public embrace of both parties and an equally public promise to show no favoritism between the noble houses of Naban in any matter in which the church has discretion. Nabani lectors had a centuries-old history of partisanship in holy office, which made the lectorship a prize worth uncountable riches. The High Ward will, of course, stand behind and enforce the Sacred Father's promise. The corner of the escritor's lip twitched. He had almost smiled. Ah, a noble idea, Majesties. I cannot say for certain, of course, but I think his sacredness might give his assent to such a suggestion. Which meant that Oxus believed business could continue as usual in Naban, despite the High Ward inserting itself into the process. We'll see about that, Miriam thought. Aloud, she said, and that agreement would be printed in a public document, posted and read out in the churches for all in Naban to read and understand. This annoyed the escritor, but he was growing better at hiding his irritation. Of course, Your Majesty, I can see no impediment. Now, I hope we can begin to plan for Your Majesty's visit. Excellent, she said. We will be happy to plan the High Throne's presence at the wedding, and the other matters in Naban, of course, as soon as we have evidence that the Blessed Father has agreed to implement our royal counsel. This struck Oxus like a thunderbolt. For the first and only time, he stumbled over his words. Again, the room had gone silent. But, Majesties, he forced himself toward composure. Your Majesties, surely I misunderstand you. It is a fortnight's voyage to Naban, even by fast ship. The wedding is only a bit more than a month away. How can I possibly provide you with the lector's agreement in time for you to make the journey? Surely the Blessed Father did not send his legate without authority to make some decisions, she said sweetly. But if these matters are beyond your remit, we will certainly understand and wait patiently to hear the lector's reply. If we cannot journey to Naban in time for the wedding, we will still be able to come and aid in negotiations between the unhappy factions." For the first time, Oxus looked out of his depth, even lost. Miriamel could not help feeling what was doubtless a childish satisfaction at seeing this graceful, powerful man so flummoxed. "I do not know what to say, Majesties. I fully admit that his sacredness is very, very anxious to have the two of you in Naban, as I am sure you are yourself, because of the importance of peace in your largest subject country. But all this at this very late moment, the two of us?" Miriamel pretended surprise. "What do you mean?" She made a show of considering it. "I see. A misunderstanding, clearly. The use of the royal we is often confusing to listeners. We are not both coming to Naban, even when these matters of advice are settled. As rulers, we have been too often absent of late from our home here in Erkenland, and especially the Hayholt. Only I will come to Naban. King Sailman will remain here at the Hayholt." "That's true," said Simon, and if he had argued long and hard against it, he did not show it now. "And I can tell you that if you mean to dispute that decision with Queen Miriamel, you would be better off saving your breath, Escritor." Oxus could only stare. His clerks whispered among themselves, sounding like a brisk wind through long grass. "So, if you would like to convey all this to his sacredness, the lector, your eminence, please feel free," Miriamel said. "The sooner the better, I assume. As you pointed out, time is short." And then she rose, and Simon rose too, a bit belatedly. The courtiers all bowed their heads. Even Oxus, in his confusion, lowered his chin to his chest, although in his case it seemed more likely he was praying for patience. For once, Miriamel was glad to be dressed in the full panoply of state. Her dress swished and rustled, and her jewelry rattled most satisfyingly as she swept from the great hall. Chapter 48. The Little Boats. Morgan followed the torches of the Scythe as best he could, but as night came on, the forest itself seemed to spring to life, doing its best to confuse and mock him. The wind rose. Trees thrashed and reached for him with twiggy fingers. Hang on just a second there. I just lost that for a moment. The wind rose. Trees thrashed and reached for him with twiggy fingers. Sometimes he almost thought he could see faces outlined in their bark by the flickering torchlight, angry faces that wanted him gone from the forest, or dead. The near silence of twilight had been replaced by a chorus of night sounds, hoots and trills and the scratching of 1,000 small things. And though Morgan did his best at first to keep some idea of direction in his head, the course the Scythe led them twisted so many times with no sign of path, track, or landmark that he quickly gave up. "Where do you think they're taking us?" he asked after what seemed most of an hour's walk. Eolair only shook his head. "We will learn," the Count said. "The Scythe do not share their secrets freely, especially secrets about where they live. You should ask your grandfather sometime about how he had to walk out of winter into summer to reach their settlement." Which made no sense to Morgan at all, but neither had most of his grandfather's tales about the Scythe. So they marched on and on through the woods, guided by half-seen figures who never paused and who seemed to know their route as clearly as if they walked across a familiar city in bright day. Morgan began to feel he was dreaming, that somewhere between the afternoon and this moment he had fallen into a deep sleep, that this was only the story his sleeping mind had chosen to tell him. As a child, when Morgan had imagined the Scythe, who figured in so many of his grandparents' solemn old stories, he had always thought of them as nearly insubstantial, like ghosts, beings that might appear and disappear in a shaft of moonlight, or materialize at the foot of one's bed to grant a wish. He had come later to understand that they were actual living creatures, but his childish notions had continued to lurk at the back of his thoughts. It had never occurred to him that they would be so real, with bodies and clothing and hard faces that seemed to examine and judge him. But every now and then he heard a quiet snatch of song, or saw one of them vault over an obstacle with the graceful power of a stag, and they suddenly became unknowably magical once more. But when he stumbled and hands reached out of the darkness to keep him from falling, their touch was hard and impersonal, less like a parent guiding a child and more like a warder conducting a prisoner to his place of confinement. As the journey wore on, Morgan grew more and more anxious, and with the anxiety came anger. Were he and Eolair ambassadors or prisoners? At one point, when a beam of moonlight found its way through the tree canopy, he looked back and saw Tanahaya being carried on her litter. In the momentary wash of blue light, her face seemed still and pale as a marble effigy, and it occurred to him that perhaps for the Scythe this march was something closer to a funeral procession. What would happen to Morgan and the Count if the wounded Scytha woman died? Would the fairy folk blame them for what had happened? Be brave, he told himself. You are a prince. If you're not brave, what are you? Though their way still turned and twisted along paths that were invisible to him, Morgan could sense that they were now heading consistently uphill. His tired legs were working harder, and he could see the sky more often through the trees, with here and there a bright, welcome spatter of stars visible against the blackness. The climb seemed to lead them on a spiral path up a large hill. Morgan could hear a stream flowing past, sometimes near to where they walked, sometimes more distant, so that he could barely make out its gurgling music. Once he had to jump across it, and again hands came out of the darkness to help him land safely. As the trees became thinner, he could finally see the peak of the hill that loomed above them, its jagged shape blocking the stars. They crossed the stream again, then crossed over it once more, and then suddenly the burning brands the leaders carried were all extinguished at once, leaving them in utter dark. Surprised, Eolair stopped, but Morgan did not realize it until he stumbled into him from behind. Walk forward, but with care, said the red-haired leader, Yajaro, as they untangled themselves. We are passing into the hill through a crevice in the rock. Morgan put his hand on the Lord Steward's back and blindly followed him. Someone reached out to guide them. He felt hands on each shoulder, and then a moment later a third hand pushing gently down on his head. This startled him so that he tried to shake it loose, but only managed to bang his skull against invisible stone. You will hurt yourself. The roof of the passage dips very low here. Let us help you. This voice spoke more kindly than Yajaro had. Morgan let himself be directed, although the complete darkness was daunting. Every sightless step felt as though it might lead him over a precipice. It was all he could do simply to keep moving forward and trust to the spidery touch of the Scythe guiding him. A few moments later, Eolair gave a low cry. Morgan was alarmed, but also puzzled, because the Count's exclamation sounded strangely like joy. 2 more hesitant steps, and the prince walked out of the dark into the full glow of the stars, thousands upon thousands burning brightly all across the sky, candles in a church far greater than any human cathedral. Morgan was dazzled. Not only did the skies sparkle fiercely above their heads, but humbler lights burned all across the narrow pocket valley, dozens upon dozens of campfires. Morgan stared at this spectacle, trying to make sense of it. Somehow they had climbed through a tunnel or crevice into a small valley nestling in the top of the blocky hill he had seen from below. As his eyes grew used to the light and the blaze of stars faded, he saw that the valley was full of Scythy folk. Many wore garments as crude and basic as those of Yajaro's band, while others were wrapped in shimmering cloth that fluttered even in this still place like the sails of ships running before the wind. A few of the Scythy turned to look at the newcomers, but none of them seemed alarmed or even perturbed. Their large eyes settled on Morgan and the Count, then turned to other things. The prince stared back, heart beating hard and fast. His fear turned almost entirely to wonder. He could hear odd, faint music coming to him from more than one spot in the valley, pipes and singing voices, and some of the figures farther up the slopes were dancing together, graceful as birds in flight. As the music and movement swirled around him like blossoms blown from the trees, the fairy stories of his childhood came back to him with all their force. In that moment, he could easily imagine a man being lured away by the Scythy folk to live 100 years in one night. "Ah, yes," said Eolair, but from his tone it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to the prince or to the empty air. "I do remember. Oh, I remember." They might have stood there for an hour, content merely to experience this unexpected wild beauty, but suddenly a shape appeared before them. "You will come with me," said Yajaro. "Prince Jiriki is not here, but the princess will want to see you." He gave the word a curious, angry emphasis. The Scytha led them up the rocky path himself, winding between the fires. This time, when Morgan or the Count stumbled, nobody reached out to help them. Dozens of Scythy watched the pair of them, curiously incurious as cats, as they climbed the slope toward a single large fire burning in a pit that had been dug at the top of a mounded grass meadow, not far from one of the valley's steep walls. A single white-haired figure sat beside the fire. Her garment was full and loose, covering her body entirely from the neck down, and Morgan thought she must be some respected elder of the Scythy folk. Grandfather talked of the Scythy's first grandmother, didn't he? But he seemed to remember that one had died in some terrible attack. As they drew closer and he could see the Scytha woman's face more clearly, he decided that not only was she much younger than the color of her hair had led him to believe, she was also one of the most beautiful creatures he had ever seen. They had almost reached the fire when she finally looked up at them. A small, nearly secretive smile curled at the edge of her mouth, and her wide eyes caught the light, glowing. Her skin seemed the same shade as the flames, as though she and the fire were part of the same thing. "So," she said, "I had a feeling. Aditu, I found them at the forest's edge," Yajaro said, his voice less harsh than it had been. Morgan thought he sounded almost apologetic. "They carried Tituno. It was the horn we heard, in truth." When she smiled again, Morgan did not know whether he wanted to marry her on the spot or crawl into her arms and let her gently rock him to sleep. "Yes, I knew it was Tituno," she said. "I can never forget when I last heard it sounding. Before Azua." She smiled. "Count Eolair, my heart is glad to see you. It has been so long." "Lady Aditu." Eolair sounded as though he might weep. "Much longer for me than for you, it seems. You have not changed." She smiled again. "Ah, but I have, as you will discover. Still, handsome boys become distinguished men. I would know you anywhere. Come, sit. And speaking of handsome boys, who is this young one? I think I know him, but I would be told. Morgan realized his mouth was open, but doing nothing useful. I am Prince Morgan, he said, but it sounded strange and impolite by itself. My Lady Aditu, Princess, I give you greetings from my grandparents. Yes, she said, as if he had asked a question. Oh, yes, in the midst of such sadness, it is good to see the face of old friends again, even at several removes. Morgan was still staring. He knew he shouldn't, but in that moment he couldn't imagine looking at anything or anyone else. We have much to discuss, Count Eolair began, but Aditu lifted her hand to forestall him. Not now, old friend. You have walked far, and walked the Scythes' ways at that, which are even more tiring. She turned to Yajaro, who had been standing silently by. What of Tanahaya? Yajaro's narrow face was grim. She is very ill. These Sodadaya say she has been poisoned. She is with the healers now. Bring me word as soon as they know anything. Aditu turned back to the Count. And now, you too must sleep. My brother will return tomorrow, and all that must be said will be said then. Eolair, it is good to see you again, against all the world's chances. Morgan, this meeting means more to me than you can know. Come, said Yajaro, while Morgan was still puzzling out her liquid, lightly accented Westerling. He and Eolair let themselves be led away from the fire. Morgan looked back and saw that the woman named Aditu had again lowered her chin to her chest, contemplating the flames as though reading a beloved old book, a familiar but still instructive companion. Morgan was exhausted. Suddenly the night seemed to be sagging in on top of him, and it was all he could do to put one foot after the other as Yajaro led them along the side of the valley to a place that had been prepared for them. 2 beds of moss in a frame of sticks, each with a blanket thin as a whisper, made of a slippery, cool substance that to Morgan's weary mind felt like a moth's wing looked. Neither he nor Eolair spoke after they climbed into their beds. For all its near insubstantiality, Morgan's blanket was very warm. He watched a patch of stars slowly spinning across the sky above his head, a wheel of lights that he thought he should recognize, but didn't. Just one more strangeness of this very strange day. Then, after only a very short time of listening to the sweet, strange sound of Scythy voices singing to each other across the pocket valley, he fell into a deep sleep. This is the next section. Eolair had to work hard to wake the prince. Morgan complained bitterly, keeping his eyes tightly closed as though some horrifying demon stood over him instead of the Count of Nad Mulak. Eolair had only the dimmest recollection of himself at the prince's age. A few sharp memories, like mountain peaks piercing a haze, but he did not believe he had ever been allowed to sleep until he woke on his own. His father, the old Count, had regarded rising with the dawn to say prayers to the gods as part of a noble's duties, and Eolair's fretful, quiet mother had hardly ever seemed to sleep at all. Come, Highness, he gave the prince a harder shake. Aditu's brother Jiriki has returned, and we must speak to our hosts. The sun is in the sky. Rouse yourself, please. Morgan gave Eolair a slit-eyed stare and a frowning look meant to shame him. Instead, the Lord Steward laughed. Come, sit up, Highness. I've brought you something to eat. The prince reached out blindly, then hesitated when he felt what Eolair had put in his hand. He peered at it suspiciously. What is it? Bread of a sort, flavored with honey. It's quite nice. And there's a stream of fresh water just below the rise over there. We're really here, Morgan said a moment later with his mouth full, looking around him. With the Scythy, I didn't think it would feel like this. It's so strange. But this home of theirs was not anything as grand as Morgan had imagined, that was certain. It has been more than 30 years since first I saw the peaceful ones up close, Eolair said, and I am still astonished each time. While the young prince tended to his morning needs, the count sat on a toppled tree in the warm sun and watched the morning life of the Scythy camp. It was both a smaller and less organized gathering than the Zediah war camp he had visited all those years ago outside Ernest Adharc. At first glance, everything seemed chaotic, with exotic figures coming and going from the small valley and many others engaged in quiet work, although Eolair could not always guess what they were truly doing. By daylight, he could see that the hill and its hidden valley stood high above the surrounding Aldhart forest. Anyone down among the trees would find it almost impossible to see even the valley's campfires at night, because the trees and the bulk of the hill would hide their glow. It seems only days since I saw you last, Eolair of Nad Mulek, someone said behind him. Eolair turned to see Jariki standing a short distance away at the top of the rise. His hair was long and white like his sister's, but like her he did not look an hour older than at their last meeting. Days to you, perhaps, the Count told him. To me, it has been a weary length of years. But whatever the length of time, it is good to see you again. Jariki e Sansre. I heard you and your company return just before first light. I heard them singing. We came a long distance, the Scytha said, then sprang down the hillside as lightly as a deer. He reached Eolair's side in a moment and looked him over with a slight frown. Your face shows pain. Have you been wounded? Eolair smiled. No. Well, yes, I was, but that is not the cause of my discomfort now. My hip aches. It is what happens when we mortals age. Our bodies do not last as long as our wits. Jariki's face remained serious. I wish that were true for all your folk, but some appear to lose their wits very young, or never to have them at all. He shook his head. His fine hair, caught by a morning breeze, momentarily obscured his features. Something about Jariki was different, Eolair thought, but not in the way he looked. He was being kind and courteous, but the Count could feel a subtle chill in his manner. He would never claim to understand the Scythy well, or to be able to read their thoughts in their faces, but he had been a servant of many mortal rulers, and had bargained in many courts in many lands. He recognized the signs that something was wrong. How is the woman we brought? Tanahaya, if I have her name right, Eolair asked. Our mortal healers did all they could for her. I promise you. If you remember the Ranaman, Tiamat, he and his wife struggled to save her in every way they knew. Jariki nodded slowly. I can tell. And they have my gratitude for that. It is hard to say whether she will survive. He looked down the rise to where Morgan kneeled, scooping water out of a stream and drinking deeply. As they both watched, the youth dunked his red-gold head into the water, then pulled it out again with a gasp of shock. Bloody tree, that's cold, he shouted. And is this truly the grandson of Sailman and Miriam El? Jariki asked. No, do not answer. I can see them both in him, bones and breath. What an awkward creature Simon was when I first met him. I thought the same, said Eolair, but there was always more to him than showed on the surface. Miriam El, too. I suspect it will also prove true with the grandson. We may hope. Something in his tone made Eolair look at him again, trying to fathom what might lurk behind the placid, high cheekboned face. Bring the young prince back to the fire circle when you are ready, Jariki said at last. There is much to talk about. Not all will be to your liking, or mine, for that matter, but this has waited too long already." Jariki turned away, leaving Eolair to wonder what he meant, but fearing the answer. As he led Morgan up the slope toward the fire circle, Eolair was surprised to see that a fire burned in the wide pit even on this bright, warm summer morning. Several Scythi waited there, including Aditu, who sat beside the fire as if she hadn't moved since the previous night. This time she wore a long hooded robe dyed in many shades of blue, from pale sky to deep near violet. Modest garments completely different from the way Eolair remembered her dressing in the past, something he had never forgotten, even after so many years. In fact, every occasion on which he had met with Aditu Noe Sansere remained nearly whole and perfect in his mind. It was not just her golden beauty that made her memorable, although she was very beautiful, even to one who was not of her kind, but the lightness of her spirit. Light as smoke, light as drifting ash. To be with her was to feel an odd peace. It was only after the last time they had met that Eolair had realized that Aditu seemed to have no fear whatsoever. To be in her presence, even in the most frightsome times, was to find a light in a dark place. As they approached her, Eolair also remembered that Aditu had told him the night before that she had changed. But other than her more decorous clothing, he could see nothing different from the first time he had seen her near the end of the Storm King's war. So what could she have meant? Almost as if she had heard his thoughts, Aditu turned and smiled. She was the only Scythi the Count of Nad Mulak had ever met whose smile seemed as natural and reassuring as a mortal's. And by the undemonstrative standards of her people, Aditu smiled often and broadly. As they approached, she stood up, and in doing so let fall her blue-hued robe. Beneath it she was dressed more like the old days Eolair remembered, partly naked like a child and unconcerned with the discomfort it created for mortals. But that belly of hers, that round golden belly, as big as a sugar melon, was something decidedly new. Eolair stumbled a little and was furious with himself, afraid that it would look like the feebleness of age. Aditu was with child. What did that mean? Did it have any bearing on the years of silence between the Scythi and the Hayholt? By the time they reached the fire pit, she had pulled on a short, flimsy jerkin that covered her down to her hips, making it a bit easier for Eolair to look at her without feeling discourteous. He took her hand in his, as he wished he had done the previous night, and brushed it with his lips. "It is good for my heart to see you again, Lady Aditu," he said. "Or is it princess?" "You should not call me that, Eolair," she said, but her tone was gentle. "It is not a word we use, or even truly an idea that we have. That was only a bit of Yajaro's unhappiness coming out." The way she said it, the suggestion that she apologized for Yajaro, caught Eolair's attention. It seemed Yajaro meant something to her. Could he be the father of her child? Eolair realized he knew almost nothing of how the Scythi dealt with such things. Did they marry? "Then, at your insistence," he said, "but to my pleasure, it will be Aditu and Eolair." He smiled simply because looking at her again after all these years made him want to smile. "It was good to see Jariki, too. I thought he was going to join us here." "We will see him very soon. But as always, there are things that must be done, my good Eolair, and they must be done certain ways. You understand that, I think." "I think I understand that as well as any mortal man alive," he said, and laughed at the truth of it. "I have lived most of my life waiting for things to be done in their certain ways, in every capital, in every country. As I look back, I marvel at how much ceremony I have endured without going mad. Our ceremonies are very different than yours, Aditu began, then interrupted herself. Oh, please, Prince Morgan, I ask your pardon. Count Eolair is an old friend, and my heart was very full. It made me forget my manners. Welcome to Ran Gojao, the most easterly of the Gojaue. Gojao, said Morgan. Eolair suspected the prince was repeating the word so slowly, not because he was particularly interested in it, but because he was fascinated with Aditu and a bit befuddled by her. It showed that the young man had good judgment in at least one respect, anyway. Gojae, little boats, Aditu explained. You will learn about them soon, I think, but now I see my brother waving to us. Come. She sprang to her feet so nimbly, despite her large belly, that Eolair could only smile again. I think that you, of all people, Count Eolair, are a person who understands ceremony and the difference between those which are empty or only for show and those which have true meaning. I like to think I do, my lady. Aditu smiled. So formal. Remember, we are to dispense with such things. In any case, now that my brother is ready, I think that it would be fitting for you to see our mother again. Likimeya? He would never forget Jariki's and Aditu's fierce parent, although even in memory the leader of the Scythi still made him uneasy. Of course, I would be grateful for the chance to pay my respects. Then you shall have it. Prince Morgan, you come too. Aditu placed herself between them, took the prince's arm and Eolair's, and moved toward Jariki, who waited beside a wide crevice in the tumbled rocks of the hillside. When he saw them coming, Jariki ducked back through the opening. They will be confused by you, Aditu warned them as they approached the crevice. Do not be startled. Your pardon, lady? Eolair asked, but who are they? The black crack before him looked like the entrance to one of the old hill tombs on the eastern part of Nadmulach, tombs the local inhabitants claimed went back to Hearn's day in the dawn of time. Aditu did not answer his question. Do not be startled, she repeated. She stepped ahead as they approached the opening and led them into the crevice. Eolair had only just ducked his head to follow her when suddenly the air seemed to burst into 1,000 mad pieces around him. He would have shouted in surprise, but so many flying things filled the air he feared they would get into his mouth. He stumbled back from the opening, and the cloud of fluttering shapes followed him out, gushing past him like beer frothing out of a tumbled barrel. Butterflies, he realized after the first few overwhelming instants. As the insects burst out into the sun, they exploded into color. Blue, brilliant orange, red, and sunflower yellow. Thousands upon thousands of butterflies, all surging around and upward, and a great maelstrom of shimmering wings. Beside him, Prince Morgan had stumbled backward and was now sitting on his rump, staring at the cloud as it seethed and fluttered all around them, filling the air so that Eolair could see little else. At last the creatures began to settle on the naked rock of the valley's edge, and in every tree and shrub. Brenniock's rainbow, said Eolair. It was not merely an oath, but also a description. On the ground beside him, Morgan goggled like a drunkard who had mistaken a second-floor window for a door. Come inside. Aditu's voice had an echo now. Eolair moved forward once more, careful not to step on any of the bright gleams of color, now gently fanning their wings on the ground around the entrance. After a moment, Morgan climbed to his feet and followed, but his face was pale and his progress cautiously slow. Eolair reached back and gently took the prince's arm, pretending it was to steady himself. When he had stepped through the entrance and could lift his head, the Count found himself in a wide but low cavern, dark except for an open shaft that let daylight fall through the irregular stone ceiling. Altogether, the irregular chamber was not much larger than his own bedchamber back in Nadmullach, a beloved place he had not visited in a long time, and for which he now felt a sudden fierce longing. He felt Morgan flinch, but kept his grip on the prince's arm. This time it was not only to steady the boy, but himself as well. At the center of the small chamber lay a figure wrapped from head to foot in something like the kind of linen bandages in which the funeral priests of Erkenland wrapped their kings and queens for burial. Only the face was exposed, a face he recognized as that of Jiriki and Aditu's mother, Likimea, though her features seemed as still and lifeless as one of the statues from Naban's Age of Gold. "By all the gods, what is this?" he asked, his voice quiet yet raw even to his own ears. "She is dead." Jiriki, who waited beside his mother's recumbent form, looked up. His face still had the same cold stillness Eolair had seen that morning. "No, our mother sleeps the long sleep, the deep sleep, but she is not dead. She has slept for a long time, though, for years, without recovering, and we do not harbor much hope she will ever wake again." "Recovering?" Eolair let go of Morgan's arm and kneeled beside the shrouded figure. A few butterflies still remained on the cavern's walls. A few more walked delicately across Likimea's body, slowly flexing their wings, seeming to burst into color once more whenever they crossed the shaft of falling sunlight that knifed down from the chamber's roof. When Eolair drew a little closer, he could see that Likimea was wrapped not in bandages, but in layer after layer of some shining white thread, an unimaginable length of the stuff. He saw the butterflies pick their way across her sleeping form and had a sudden idea of who had actually shrouded Likimea for this strange sort of entombment. What happened to her? Jiriki gave him a sharp look as though he had said something odd, then turned away. "She was shot with an arrow in the heart." "Murgha's red eye! Who did this?" Aditu stepped forward, but her gaze did not leave her mother's expressionless face. "We do not know for certain, except that the murderers were mortals." "Mortals?" The Count was horrified. For a time he could only stare at Likimea's wan, golden face. "You say murders," he said at last, "but she has not died. The gods willing, perhaps she will still recover and identify those who attacked her so they can be punished." "They will still be murderers," said Jiriki, his voice quiet but hard as the crypt's stone walls. "They killed 11 more of our folk. Only our mother and one other survived the attack." "Oh, gods, no." Eolair could not stare at Likimea's empty face any longer. "No. Tell me what happened." "We will, but not here," said Aditu. "The Yazira, this gathering place, belongs to our mother now. We will not sully it with any more talk of the cowardly beasts who attacked her." As they moved toward the cavern's entrance, Eolair saw a few butterflies drifting back in. He thought nothing of it at first, but then had to hang back for a moment, as a handful more, then dozens, flew back in. Jiriki said something sharp to Aditu in their own musical tongue. By the way, a quick insert here. I'm almost at 8 o'clock, but I'm going to read to the end of this little mini section, I think. Jiriki said something sharp to Aditu in their own musical tongue. Butterflies streamed back into the cavern in force now, circling the Count's head, filling the spaces between floor and ceiling. But where was Prince Morgan? Eolair turned in sudden apprehension and saw him standing beside Likimea's body, staring down at her with sickened fascination, an expression he had never seen the prince wear. "Morgan!" Prince Morgan, come away, he called. More and more butterflies were returning to the cavern, making it hard to see past the glimmer and shadow of their wings. The prince said something Eolair could not hear. What? Come away! Morgan spoke louder this time. She's trying to talk. Jariki sprang across the room and crouched beside his mother's body. Rabbit, come to me, he cried. It is true. Aditu hurried to join him. But she has not spoken since she was first struck down, since she survived the first fever. Eolair, too, moved closer. He could see Likimea's face moving in her silken shroud, but barely, as though a mere tremor of dream made its way to the surface. Aditu leaned very close and put her hand on her mother's breastbone, then put her ear next to Likimea's mouth. For a moment she remained listening intently. Then at last Aditu straightened and stood up. She curled her hands around her belly as if to protect the child within, and again spoke to her brother in their own language. Could you understand what your mother said? Eolair asked her. I could, said Morgan, to the Count's utter astonishment. The youth looked as though his entire world had just turned downside up. His eyes were wide and shocked, his face pale as parchment. I could understand her. I swear. I heard it in my head. She said, all the voices lie except the one that whispers, and that one will steal away the world. The prince had an expression Eolair had not seen before, one of complete and frightened confusion. Jariki and his sister both stared at Morgan, then at each other. After an achingly long pause, Aditu turned back to Count Eolair, her face unusually blank. Our mother is silent again, she announced. I do not think she will speak more. We should go from this place. We have much that is new to think about. And you too still have much to learn about all that has happened between our peoples. And that's where we're going to stop. So, I hope that, yes, looks like we stayed on. I couldn't tell because for a moment one of my versions of it kind of froze up. But anyway, so with that, I will be back next. Yeah, I'm not going to Germany till the end of next month. So I will be back next week. We will be continuing with the adventures of Eolair and Morgan in Fairytown and various other bits and pieces and plot strings and plot threads and plot stuff. Anyway, but I want to thank you for joining me. As always, it is a great pleasure to spend some time with you. Be good to yourselves. Be good to your friends and loved ones. Help out those that you can help out when the opportunity arises. And yeah, that's basically it. So thank you very much. And peace. And I will see you next week. Be well.